Now let's look at the conclusions of the study. Conclusions pull together the various results of the study and consider what they mean and suggest their importance. There are several types of conclusions, and a few I'll talk about here. Findings summarize two or more results within the study. Interpretations will indicate what the results and findings mean within the study and within the context of the prior research on the topic. Generalization extrapolates the results or findings beyond the studied units or what's contained within that study. And implications suggest how the findings may be important for policy, practice, theory, and subsequent research. Recommendations will tell you what should be done as a result of this study and urge specific actions with respect to maybe policy, practice, theory, or other types of investigative activities. Conclusions have considerable appeal, and they really are the objective of any research study. They're usually pretty easy to read, and it's really tempting to skip most of the research and jump to the conclusions and the recommendations, but I would tell you that would be a mistake because you're going to miss a lot of the heart and soul of what the research should be saying anyway, if it's followed a lot of the rules that we've already talked about. And you don't want to do that as well, because then as a consumer you're really ill-equipped to make a judgment as to whether or not it's good research, because you haven't fundamentally looked at the whole of the product in order to judge it. So just don't skip to the end. If you want to skim it to get kind of an idea of where you're going, that is to say, read the abstract and then the conclusion. That's not a bad idea. I find myself doing that often, so just remember to read the middle as well. Now, conclusions and recommendations are not an automatic extension of the results. They require careful inference in light of the limitations of the study, which are the bounds of the questions of the study, the context in which the questions were studied, population sampling frame, interventions that occurred or were administered, and in light of the limitations of the study, the methodological shortcomings, they also require broad knowledge of the topic being addressed. They also require combining facts and values and some speculation. Even eminent researchers occasionally blow the conclusions and recommendations of a study. It is not uncommon to find a conclusion or two with no real support from the results, and occasionally a conclusion will be contradicted by the results. The most common reasons for that are fatigue and ambition. The conclusions and recommendations cannot be generated until the rest of the research is completed, and by then maybe the research has taken more time and money than expected. So the conclusions and recommendations are sometimes hastily assembled. Additionally, many researchers have the hopes of making important contributions, and at the end they sometimes succumb to concluding and recommending maybe more than is well justified by their study. So whether there is good justification for the conclusions, it can usually be determined by reading the research report itself. And readers may infer additional conclusions that are well supported by the study but not expressly stated within the report. It should be noted, however, that some omissions in the report may make some conclusions appear unjustified, even though the researcher actually has good justification for them. So let's just talk about some common errors when generating the conclusions and recommendations. The first one is stating conclusions that the researcher thinks are correct and important, but for which the study provides no support. The next one is generalizing well beyond the questions, contexts, population, and interventions that were actually studied. Next one, finding that they forgot to add additional cautions where there are important limitations in methods and or their execution within the study. Fourth one, falsely interpreting statistical significance and the lack thereof. Fifth one, selectively focusing on some results while ignoring others and the pattern of results. Moving from inference to values and speculation is the next one, while using wording that clearly indicates that those things were actually involved. In other words, maybe representing the research as being something that it wasn't quite. So, When you're assessing the conclusions of research, you want to ask yourself the following. What conclusions appear to be well supported by the pattern of results, the delimitations or the limitations of the study? Which conclusions do not appear to be well supported? You should be able to glean this pretty easily by looking at the study from sort of an overview and going back sometimes and skimming the research just one more time to remind yourself of what actually transpired and what didn't, perhaps, is a good idea. I find myself with complicated things reading them several times over, which is a little frustrating because I kind of like that instant gratification of knowing exactly where I've been and what it meant, but with certain pieces of research, in fact many pieces of research, it takes several deep dives to kind of get the whole thing together and then emerge with a meaning without getting stuck in the details. So then the next question you want to ask is, which interpretations, implications, and recommendations are well supported according to what we just asked ourselves about the conclusions? And are they well supported by what is generally known about the problem and by prior research findings? The whole point and end result of being a consumer of research is understanding what it is that you're looking at within the context of the body of knowledge that you're working with. You can look at a particular piece of research, but if you have no knowledge whatsoever of what the research is about or what it might mean, it really isn't very useful, and you as a consumer are fairly ill-equipped to decide. But if it's something that you know a lot about, then you can say, you know what, I'm not buying that information. I just don't believe what they're telling me is really true. So sometimes it's a matter of taking all of these things, some of which are quantifiable and some of which are not, and putting them all together to say, yeah, this is a good, strong piece of research, and I can build arguments based upon this research for or against something. And if you look at the practical applications within a work environment, you want to build a case for or against something, a business case, if you will. You have to make sure that you feel comfortable that you've got really good research. Otherwise, you won't be standing on the shoulders of giants. It could be something else entirely. So be careful when you look at this stuff, and if you have questions, have someone else read it. Get another opinion. It's always good to involve others in bouncing ideas back and forth. And when you're done with your research, the best advice that I have ever received is to get as many eyes on your research as possible before you actually submit it to someone, because other people will easily see the things that you're too close to it to see. You won't be able to see your own flaws after a while because you've been working with it so much. So research carefully, be a good consumer, and make good decisions.